James Wiseman is one of the most well-known recent quote-unquote busts or draft misses of the last 5 or 10 years. And it's interesting because it was very predictable at the time. I know this because myself and many others didn't think he would be that great at the time. It was kind of the common, like, quote unquote draft Twitter take. But it was, understandable to see why mainstream people liked him. He was super fast in a straight line for 7'3". Like, his ability to get up and down the court, like, at that height is just very, very rare. And like in high school, he showed some of the ability to like drive and dunk on slower bigs, right? And Wiseman was always just freakishly large. This play is ridiculous, right? He caught the ball pretty much like right here at like way, way, way below the rim and just finishes way above the rim. He was a crazy size movement in a straight line guy. And Wiseman only played 3 games at Memphis because of some like investigation bullshit. He could do like a nice little turnaround fade away. He was pretty, these just like looks very smooth, right? A huge guy taking and making shots like this is very impressive. But as we all know, the Wiseman stuff did not work out. And I think there's a lot of really interesting scouting lessons to learn from this. Even though, on the surface, it looks like a guy with a lot of potential who blocks shots and stuff like this. But there's a ton to learn here to me about like responsible scouting and how much scouting and good scouting matters. And some of the lessons we can learn from James Wiseman. Because like I said, this was a common opinion at the time that he was not going to be a top 3 level prospect. And one of the main issues is that his tools weren't functional. And what I mean by functional, right? I've talked about this in videos before, that it doesn't matter if you can run in a straight line super fast, right? Because this is just not a skill that's that useful in basketball, right? Like, yeah, if you're running in transition, that happens, but it's not something that happens on the majority, every player, the majority of play. Something that is going to happen on majority of plays if you are a big is guarding the pick and roll. And Wiseman was really, really rough as a pick and roll defender. It was more than just like positioning and stuff, but his movement skills and his ability to change directions and open his hips, like you can see how slow his feet and his hips are moving here, right? He's not able to contain this guard from turning the corner. He's very high up. He's not sitting low in his stance, and because of that, the guard can easily turn him and get around. And some of like the hedge stuff was just really brutal. Where when you're hedging the pick and roll, right, you've got a basically a good hedge would be Wiseman jetting out this way and forcing the guard as far away as possible from the basket so his man can recover. But Wiseman just like takes a weird step, lets him go by, and then ends up passing for a wide open 3. And Wiseman just didn't have the short area quickness necessary to play center in the modern NBA. And that's so important, right? More than being able to move in a straight line, it's more important to be able to change directions. And Wiseman, you can see that his hips are just not opening very fast, gives up a lane. Lucky that I think that's one of my all-time goats, Will Richardson. Lucky that Will Richardson ends up missing here, but you can see Wiseman's size might have impacted that shot, right? Because he is just so enormous. But the level of engagement as a pick and roll defender was really problematic. And I think that ground coverage, changing direction stuff, which I talked about so many times on this channel with elite defensive prospects like Wemby and Evan Mobley and Chet Holmgren and Jaren Jackson, right? All of them could cover a ton of ground, whereas Wiseman, he couldn't because of the change of direction stuff, right? He goes to close out on the shooter, just jumps by him and is totally out of the play at that point, right? There's no recovering there. There's no value gains. And even though Wiseman definitely, had some moments as a shot blocker, he was always just so raw and jumpy, right? Wiseman was kind of in a weird position here. He's not exactly doubling, but he's in help position, but he's not doubling and he's leaving his man. And then he jumps at a pretty weak pump fake, ends up fouling and one. And this was a big problem going back to even high school, right? Like he playing against this weaker competition, Wiseman would always kind of jump at stuff that he shouldn't, and that would get him in trouble regularly. So that was another one of the issues, was just like the discipline and the positioning, right? You can see that Wiseman, one, just like didn't have the strength, which, he was super young. He could have developed that strength, and I definitely think he has added some strength, but Wiseman just not quick enough to cut this angle off, right? Like the really quick centers would slide a couple times right here, cut this angle off, and force a stop. But Wiseman just didn't have the footwork, the technique, and something we're gonna talk about a little bit more is that though Wiseman is enormous, he was never a good shot blocker for a couple reasons. One, his instincts and timing and such aren't great, but two, it's because of how slow he gets off the floor, right? Notice how Wiseman like has to really bend his knees and like it takes him a while to get up and to get to his highest point. So even though he is, tall and can get up, he struggles to get to that highest point before the shot is gone. And like when he can sag off, he can slide a little bit in a straight line and force defenders into weird position just because he was so enormous. And also important to note that this is like really bad competition, like low major D1 teams he was playing here, right? Except for Oregon, obviously. Oregon is good, but even though play, I believe this was not called a goaltend, but definitely should have been. The ball is on the way down, right? It's clear to see. But look at Wiseman, like swing his arms, bend his knees. Whereas a guy like Mobley or Wemby or whoever, Rudy Gobert, they just kind of go up and without having this big load time, they just go up and swat the ball, and that was a big limiter, right? Wiseman, even when he saw these plays, couldn't get them in time because of his lack of vertical pop. So he was huge and tall, but just couldn't get off the ground very quickly. But I think there was some potential as a defender that obviously was never realized, right? I think Wiseman overall was like a solid prospect. Like he wasn't horrible to me. I would have happily drafted him in the top 20, but top 3 was always nonsense to me. But there was a little bit of stuff. He's very, really good possession here, sliding to cut off the baseline there, force a kick out that ends up missing. And I think he might have got the rebound there as well. Wiseman, we're gonna see here, he's like kind of gonna, I think this is where he digs at the nail. Yeah, there's certainly potential here for a 7'3" guy to be active and to dig at the nail and to make plays like that. Like I think it's possible that Wiseman developed into a better defender that he did. Again, we see him kind of containing here on the baseline. Again, against pretty bad competition, but containing against the guard, contesting from behind. It's not perfect because he still did get turned around here. He didn't cut off the angle like would have been better, but he did contain some with his size and his length. That was always going to be the major advantage with Wiseman. And then on the offensive end, I think his main issues were the feel for the game, as I talked about in so many instances. What are the most important predictors of upside, most important things in general? And Wiseman really struggled with that. He also struggled with touch, where it just seems like a lot of these shots, like close to the basket, were way off, and not having that soft touch as a big man is problematic. Wiseman, of course, was a good offensive rebounder, like I said, like we talked about before. He could like seal and score on the interior and do some good stuff there, but the touch was a problem, and the lack of passing feel was a bigger problem. I really don't exactly know what he was trying to do in this play, where he just kind of like doesn't shoot and turns it over. But Warriors legend Lester Quinones wide open here in the right corner, right? Wide open. Oregon's defense is pointing, go cover him. And Wiseman just doesn't really see it because he didn't have the vision or the awareness. Again, wide open out on the perimeter. Takes a dumb kind of fadeaway shot that doesn't end up falling. So these were kind of the big concerns. And, Wiseman just kind of running into a guy, ends up committing a charge. But I don't think Wiseman was like hopeless offensively, because he was enormous and had some post moves and stuff like that. But I think going to the Warriors in the top 2 just like ruined his development, because they were on their shitty 2 timelines crap where they expected Wiseman to contribute, when in reality, especially on the defensive end, Wiseman was years away from being a contributor, and all of his defensive weaknesses were immediately exposed, where in the pick and roll, teams would just kind of shred him. He couldn't play high up at the level, right? Because he didn't have the hips or the feet to change directions against quick guards, and just, as we talked about before, not explosive enough off the floor to get to a lot of these shots, where in college or high school he could get to them, but in the pros, those windows, the timing gets so much tighter. And without being able to guard in the pick and roll, like, teams could easily target and kind of carve him up for a Warriors team that had expectations, and of course he didn't end up staying with them. There was some promise and flashes, but like we see Wiseman kind of turning around and contesting Jaden McDaniels there. Again, in a straight line when he's not sliding. When he's running in a straight line, Wiseman was very impressive. But that's just not a big part of basketball. That's not something that basketball players have to do as often as they have to change directions and open their hips and all of that good stuff, right? Basketball's not played in a straight line most of the time. But there was some stuff, right? Wiseman kind of out of position here. Decent, kind of helped the baseline, but really doesn't recover where he could have, again, he wasn't comfortable sliding and cutting off angles. It was all straight line, turning his hips. And I think going to the Warriors, like getting drafted at 2, really did screw him because of the expectations. And this is why, to me, responsible scouting is so important. And I think the Wiseman story is a good example of why I'm so passionate about the work that I do and that we do, because like it's not Wiseman's fault that he got drafted too highly and that he was misevaluated out of high school, right? This was something that people were seeing. And you can go look back on my Twitter or people's Twitter. A ton of people were understood that this was going to happen with Wiseman, right? And yet, like, you know, the Warriors took him because he was like impressive at dinner, and they wanted to take a really raw center who's played 3 college games, right, and have him contribute right away. Where, you know, if Wiseman was like the 20th pick, right, and got drafted to maybe a better situation and has been sitting on the bench for 3 or 4 years, I don't think the narrative about it would be negative. It would be more like, okay, yeah, this is a, you know, potentially young, promising player that might have some upside. And I think that, you know, maybe is still on the table with Wiseman. I am intrigued by him on my Pacers. I think he'll be good in the transition offense. Defense is probably always going to be kind of rough. I think some of Wiseman's inherent mobility and feel issues limit the defensive ceiling pretty significantly. But I don't think, like I said, I don't think Wiseman was always destined to be a bust or to kind of start his career how he did. And if he was in a more favorable and realistic situation, right, where he was given time and the expectations weren't so high, I think Wiseman could have been a pretty solid player. And I guess he still could be, right? He's still pretty young. But there are certain inherent things that Wiseman lacks that top prospects have to have. Non-negotiable feel, functional tools, just the special traits that I've talked about so many, where I guess Wiseman's like running in a straight line is technically a special kind of trait, but it's not one that really matters or moves the needle as a kind of a basketball player, really. So let me know what you think of this breakdown of prospect Wiseman. There's not a ton of tape on him, obviously, right? Because he only played 3 college games and like whatever in high school. But I think it's a really interesting case study of some of the kind of follies of traditional upside projection, right? Height, weight, speed. The NBA loves that. They'll see like, oh, these big tall guys who can, you know, run in transition. We can make something out of that. When in reality, we should be looking at guys with super high feel or unique athletic tools that work in a functional way that actually derive value on a basketball court. And that's something that Wiseman never really had, and unfortunately has not been put in a position to develop, you know, on the goddamn Pistons. Like, that's going to be, like, you know, he was never going to get better on the fucking Pistons. But hopefully Wiseman can rebound in Indiana. I would love that as a Pacers fan, and just I think it would be cool to see him bounce back and improve as a basketball player. But let me know what you think about Wiseman and his development overall.